When we're swimming in a sea of trauma, sometimes the trauma is all we know. To feel numb can be our normal state. This is what makes trauma insidious, that the assault of trauma can cloak itself and vanish from sight. Andrew Bennett is a magician who is a member of the Magic Circle, the world's premier magic society. He's also a two-time TEDx presenter and a leading executive coach and organizational consultant. By the age of 16, Andrew had lost 4 members of his family. His mother and sister were lost in a sudden trauma of being hit by a drunk driver. His grandfather, a man that Andrew adored, died by suicide, and his grandma Nin was ravaged by a cruel disease that took her life over many months. Despite experiencing trauma after trauma, Andrew had a hard time identifying himself as a trauma survivor. Andrew is the ideal guest to help us see how trauma often pulls a vanishing act in our own psyches. Now let's drop into the story. Content warning, please note this episode contains reference to self-harm. Glad to have you here today to have this conversation. It's a really important conversation based on the pre-call that we had, which was really revealing to me about the nature of trauma, not just for you, but for many people that I've served. Now, you've had a number of unusual challenges in your life. Can you tell us something about those challenges?
Sure. When I was almost 3 years old, I lost my mother and my sister to a drunk driver. So mom was 33, Kelly was 7, and my grandparents took us in. So my father, my older brother, and I were left, and my mother's parents took us in. And we stayed there for about a year, and my father remarried. And then he took my older brother, and they went off and basically started a new family. And my father and his new wife had a son a few years later. But Dad really wasn't involved in my life. He was basically a bystander in my life. So my grandparents became my parents. They were my mom and dad, and that's how I felt about them. That's how I saw them. And when I was 13, my grandfather had a mental breakdown. And so for the next 3 years, he was in and out of mental institutions all over the state of Michigan. I grew up in Michigan. And he had just come home, and he'd been home for about 2 weeks. And one morning he went down into our barn and he took his own life.
Took his life when you were about 13.
I was 16.
16 at that time.
He
So
had
by
the
the age of
breakdown when I was
16.
13. Yeah.
Gotcha. So by 16, you had lost your mom, you'd lost your sister, you'd effectively lost your dad and your brother because they had moved out, right? This was before cell phones, so I imagine you didn't have a lot of contact with them. And then your grandfather.
They lived about a mile away, actually. It was a very small town. Our town was 421 people. And my dad and my brother lived about a mile away. And yet I only saw my father my birthday and Christmas.
So walkable distance, but you really still only saw him a couple times a year for holidays. So you lost basically your entire sort of first family, and then your grandfather became like a dad to you. And by 16, he died by suicide.
Yes. And then my grandmother, when I was 24, contracted spinal myelitis, which is like meningitis, and it encircles your spinal cord and compresses it. And so literally overnight, she became a quadriplegic. So she was breathing through a hole in her trachea. She had to spasm to get every breath. And she was that way for 9 months. She was 6 months in intensive care at the University of Michigan Hospital. And then her final 3 months, we took her back to our farm and she had 24-hour care. And that's where she died. But, this woman had to endure 9 months of spasming for every breath. I don't know how she did it. And it just was torturous. I can't imagine what that was like for her.
What was it like for you to be helpless and watch your grandmother pass in that way?
Yeah, it was. I felt it was so. I was really angry about it
Mhm.
because my grandmother had endured so much in her life. She'd lost her daughter, she'd lost her granddaughter. Even before she had her children, she thought that she was pregnant when she was about 19, and it turned out to be an 8-pound tumor. I mean, she had been abandoned when she was 13 years old. Her mother left her at a restaurant.
Mm,
She had been through hell, and then her husband takes his own life, and the mental illness. And
yeah,
yet, she was the one that was my rock. I mean, I idolized my grandfather, but my grandmother was the hero in the whole story. She was my rock, and she was always there. And for her to end life with that kind of just cruel suffering
yeah,
uh, made me just so angry. And of course, we didn't know what to do
of
to help
course.
her. She wanted to go back to the farm, and so we found the money to do that. And um,
Wow,
but it was just heartbreaking.
unimaginable.
Hmm.
And then you continued to have unusual challenges in your life.
Yeah, there was a little bit of a breather.
Mm,
So I lost my grandmother. We called Nin.
mhm,
We lost Nin when I was 24, and then when I was 39, I built my dream house in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'd saved my money and build this dream house, brand new house. And within 6 months, my wife started losing her hair and gaining weight, and we hadn't changed our lifestyle. I developed irritable bowel syndrome. So, to make a long story short, the house had toxic mold. It had aspergillus. And so the health department condemned the house. We tried to get the builder to fix it, but they would not do anything. We sued. They got the top mold defense attorney in the country and
mm,
kept this stringing along. And we ran out of money, went bankrupt. We moved into an apartment to start over again. And one afternoon in August, lightning struck the roof right over our bedroom, and no one was home at the time, but lightning struck the roof right over our bedroom, started a fire, and the roof eventually collapsed on our apartment. So if you look at pictures of that now, it looks like God just kind of said, "You right there." It's like the one spot in the building that
yeah.
that was
I
completely
saw the
destroyed.
picture. I saw the picture you sent me, and just as you said, it was like this lightning bolt down from the sky hitting only the roof of your apartment.
Yes.
And the interesting thing about our conversation, I mean, you had been through so much. You lost your mother, you lost your sister, you lost your, grandfather, your brother, your father, live a mile away, but you never see them. Your grandmother, who's your rock, she dies. Your dream house has mold. You move, and your house, your apartment is struck by lightning, and you said to me during our pre-call, but I didn't really see any of that as trauma.
Yeah. And this is just something that I've been realizing lately is that um, I've looked back at my life a lot, as one
Yeah.
does, but it's been kind of like an intellectual, like, yeah, I've been through a lot of stuff, but I never
Mhm.
saw it as trauma. And I'm starting to um, not only realize that it was, but also realize the importance of acknowledging that.
Yes. Yes. You said to me, I'm in my 60s now, and I'm just starting to reckon with the fact that this was a trauma,
Yes.
multiple layers of trauma. So that
Mhm.
begs the question, what is trauma to you, Andrew? What does that mean?
Well, because I'm starting to come to terms with this as trauma, I've had to think about that lately. What is trauma?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think if you look it up in the dictionary, it says something like an injury. It's probably when you think about trauma, it's like medical oriented. You have a trauma as a result of an accident or something. It's like a big event. So uh, it's an injury, but I'm really starting to understand that it's more than just physical injury. That trauma can be psychological. I think it can be spiritual, mental. There's different kinds of trauma. And then I think there's different like degrees of trauma. There's like trauma with a big T, and then there's trauma with a small T that's kind of more insidious, but it's all still trauma. It's
When we
all
do that big
relative.
T, small t, right? It always makes me think that one is maybe not so bad, but that's not
Right.
really your story either. Because one of the things that we talked about in our brief conversation was perhaps trauma isn't just about these big events that happen to us that leave us feeling this sense of horror or helplessness, the
Hmm.
insidious stuff, like what doesn't happen for you, the lack of contact with your father and brother when they moved, that's a trauma. And that can have a more devastating impact on many people than sometimes the big events.
It is. It's lately I've been realizing the impact of my father's absence in my life, and not just his absence, but kind of like, you know, why is he absent? And the stories that I told myself because of that. So, as you're saying, it's sometimes the less dramatic
Mhm.
things that I mean, I'm working through this in therapy right now. And I keep saying to my therapist, every once in a while, I'll just kind of shake my head. I'll drop my head, shake my head, and say, man, it just pisses me off so much how much space my father is taking up in my brain because, he just doesn't deserve that relative to the involvement he had in my life. And it just makes me so mad that he gets that much of my that he has that big of an impact on me. And so, but that I think is the way that it is insidious, and you don't realize it as much.
Yeah. And you didn't seem to really interpret your grandfather's death as an abandonment. That felt different when you talked about that. Did I pick up on that accurately? Can we talk about how that was different for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think I did see that as abandonment. The biggest thing with my grandfather's suicide was how it terrified me about life. Really, it was kind of an
Mhm.
existential impact because, as I said, I idolized my grandfather and I wanted to be just like him. And I think a lot of my identity was attached to him. And so when my hero took his own life, it certainly wasn't conscious. I didn't consciously at 16 say, well, what does that mean about life? But I think, subconsciously deep down inside, and then over the years,
Yeah.
as it keeps reverberating, I think I must have said, I must have come to this conclusion that, well, maybe life isn't worth living. And I have been just terrified that I'm going to get to that same place and realize that, really this is all hopeless.
Yeah, I as I told you, in our conversation before, I see that a lot with a lot of people that have lost someone and they didn't really see it coming. That person perhaps was their hero or somebody they greatly looked up to or needed and they say, what does this mean for my own chances?
Yeah.
It thrusts people into a sense of fear about, could I sort of catch this suicidal desire, almost as though it were contagious. But as you've sat with that, that's not been your story. And one of the things that came through for me in our conversation was you were secure in your grandfather's love.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely
You
knew that
were,
he adored
yep,
me. Yep. Yep.
you knew that he adored you. You had so many experiences like that that you were solid on that question.
You
And
bet.
so I think there's an important point to be made here because sometimes people think about suicide and they create morality as part of that decision, as though,
Uh,
suicide, is an abandonment or, that's often a question I've seen with loss survivors. Why did my loved one leave? I don't believe it's a moral issue. I believe when people are at the end of the tunnel, and I've seen enough people at the end of the tunnel of despair, that they aren't thinking really anything about their loved ones because they're in so much pain. There's a profoundly altered state of consciousness and a disconnection with the people and values that they hold sacred. But when he died, it was a deep grief and it shook you to the core, but it wasn't an abandonment. And I think that's an important point relative to your dad moving a mile away and not spending any more time with you.
yes. And the times that I did spend with my dad were not very validating for me. I did not feel that my father really loved me.
You can break the barriers of mental health. Given Hour's mission is to provide help and hope to those in need. As of 2021, Given Hour's volunteer network of mental health providers has delivered over 360,000 hours of barrier-free, no-cost mental health care. With a small gift of $5, you can give help and hope. Your generosity will allow Given Hour to deliver confidential mental health services and vital education tools. Thank you for your support because mental health is just as important as our physical health. Visit www.givenhour.org to learn more or to donate. And in talking about, your dad and what happened to you, you had you had some reservations about sharing. Can you say something about that?
Yes, I really don't talk very much about my father because he was a good man. I wouldn't want people hearing my story to think, what an awful person. He was a good man. He was the funeral director in our little town of 421 people. Well, he served the whole county, but so he was
Uh-huh.
very well known. He was respected. He was kind of a pillar in the community of, solid citizen, came from a long line of funeral directors actually. And he he provided consolation for a lot of people. He was a gentle man. Um, and I know that there were other influences on my father, and that I know that my grandparents probably contributed. Well, I don't think probably. I don't know how they did because it was
Mhm.
kind of kept out of earshot of me, or I didn't see anything. But I know that my grandparents, particularly my grandmother, was very protective of me.
Right.
And I think there were issues that influenced my father's level of involvement. So, I get that side of it while also acknowledging that my relationship with him was very uh, difficult, caused a lot of pain.
And you decided to share for what reason?
Well, I don't want people to think ill of my father. As I said, despite how it's impacted me, I know he was a good man. Um, and I don't want people to think ill of him. What's more important, I think, is that your listeners realize how things like this that that
Yes.
impact particularly children. That's the important thing, is
Yeah.
um, that this dynamic between a parent and a child can result in a lot of challenges for the
It
child.
was really damaging for you. And your
Hmm.
father's a complicated man who
Yes.
ironically provided consolation to a lot of other people and had a lot of good qualities as well. And so you want
Yeah.
to acknowledge the truth
Yeah.
of your story, but also who your dad was in the fullness of his personality.
Yes. Absolutely.
Can you pick out any particular memories that you'd be willing to share of a time when you really felt like, wow, he's really moved on to a new family?
Yeah. Christmas. Every year for Christmas, I would go to my father's home, and they had a son. He's 7 years younger than I. And so we would have Christmas, and my older brother, who was living with them, my older brother and I would usually get a gift, like a sweater, usually a sweater. And so we would open that gift, and there's the sweater, thank you. And then we would sit and watch our younger half brother open gifts for several hours.
Yeah.
And, when you're going through this stuff, you don't necessarily say, "Oh, this is so awful and this is terrible," and you just kind of, "Well, let me help you put that together." Do you have batteries for this? It was that kind of thing where we're participating, but it
Yeah.
was gift after gift after gift. I just the other day I was looking through some old family photos, and I actually found a couple of pictures of
Mm.
that circus. And there I am standing amid all the debris. And so, as I said, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier about, that's not a great big trauma with a T. I wasn't beaten. I didn't experience a buddy dying in combat. It wasn't one of those great big spotlight moments. It was, yeah, it was just happened, and you go through it. But then later in life, I had all kinds of problems with my self worth, and I still do. And I realized that things like that contributed to it. So yeah, that's an example of when I realized that really my dad has one son.
That is absolutely a trauma. And one of the things about trauma is that it shapes our identity. It changes and shapes our identity at that core level. And a lot of trauma survivors that I've worked with have struggled with questions around deservingness, around worth. And it
Mhm.
gets confusing because they start to think, well, because I didn't go to combat, I must not be deserving of calling this PTSD or trauma. Is that something you struggled with?
Absolutely. Big time. I mean, I've always felt like, um, I don't know if it's consciously thinking I don't deserve to, um, I can't be suffering from this, or, like, man up, stop being such a snowflake. You weren't abused. You weren't beaten. You didn't see horrific things. The things that you hear other people experiencing, I just thought, what's the way to describe it? Other people have the right to um, to be in pain, to struggle, to be hurt by these things. But I had loving grandparents. I actually, I was very happy. It's such a weird juxtaposition of all these terrible losses, and yet also tremendous joy and happiness. But I have thought for many, many years that um, I can't, I can't, I just don't deserve to regard this as suffering, because there are people who really have suffered.
And here's the interesting thing even with people who have really suffered like you. I mean, if I gave most people that list of life challenges and traumas, they would say that person has had a highly traumatic life, right? But there's often this tendency to say, well, somebody has it worse. And
Yeah.
you see this over and over again, with warfighters, the story is always, well, I went through some stuff, but yes, I was sexually assaulted, but or I watched a buddy die in war, or you know, I was hazed, but somebody else needs that treatment more than I do.
Hmm.
Somebody else, I don't want to take that spot from somebody else. So I've started to see that the nature of trauma is that it creates this kind of comparative suffering thing where it
Hmm.
makes people question their worth and
Hmm.
their deservingness of healing. And I
Hmm.
really want to just pull that out and reckon with that belief directly.
And I think that's where I am in my treatment right now, is acknowledging that these have been traumas, and a lot of I mean, I've been in therapy for decades trying to make my way through this, and again, it's not like I'm immobilized or anything. I am
No,
pretty high functioning,
you're very high
uh,
functioning. Yeah.
but but inside it's rough. And so I've been seeking relief from that pain, and relief from the grips that it has on me that result in me not being my best or my happiest. And so anyway, I'm at this point in treatment where acknowledging this is opening up opportunities for me to seek different treatment. It's been largely an intellectual exploration for me. Like, I can look at all of this stuff on paper as if
Hmm.
it's my, resume of loss, and say, yeah, that's a lot to go through. I get it. And I can understand how somebody would feel that they're not a worthwhile human being from that story and all of that. But it's intellectual. I haven't, um, and I don't know where that will take me, but I haven't somehow gotten to I think the real felt depth of it.
Yeah.
And
The
I don't know
way
what that means.
the way through it is to go straight through that and to really allow yourself to feel that in your body and sort of face that directly and walk through that experience outside of your sort of intellectual understanding of it. I think part of the nature of trauma is that it makes us emotionally numb. So when you had that first shocking trauma of losing your mom and your sister, one of the pieces about trauma that's very common is that the emotional numbness can um, play out in terms of how other events will land for us. That if you're
Uh,
already sort of numbed out, that will kind of continue and you'll sort of be a fish swimming in that stream without awareness. And that's people. That's most people.
mhm.
Um, I also want to say, because I'm not your therapist, I'm your friend, that because I've got to know you, it like the story of Christmas morning, like, makes me wanna rough someone up there a little bit. You know, like, that is so unfair. You are a high functioning, loving person. It's just so unjust that you would be abandoned by your father. And that makes me sad. It makes me angry at the same time to sort of hear that experience. So I would guess your therapist is having some of those emotions too when you share those stories, but maybe he or she doesn't have the ability to say that, or depending on their therapeutic stance, they
Well,
may
she's
share.
amazing. She's an amazing gift, my therapist. And she does an amazing job of doing her job as a professional therapist should. And there are times when I think it is part of the therapy, though, for her to help me get perspective on that, to say, no, you don't need to accept that as that's what that's just what happens, because that's messed up.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's messed up.
many years ago, I attempted to have a relationship with my father when I was an adult, and he just didn't have the capacity for that. And um, I I think the last time we communicated, I wrote him a scathing letter, and I brought up the Christmas thing, and I said, that was cruel.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. But you've also, you haven't stayed stuck. You've really been a seeker and you've been in therapy for a long time and you've done a beautiful TED talk,
Mm.
as well as really
Hmm.
helped a lot of other people move forward in their wellness. Tell us about some of the things you've learned about healing from trauma.
Well, I think my life up until about 50 was survive.
Okay.
And again, it was not like that was just intense, full on suffering all that time. I had great success in business. Ross Perot was my mentor. He sent me to Australia for a couple of years. There's so many good things. I had my own TV show because I'm a magician also. I had my own TV show when I was 14. And there's been so many good things, but it really was, for the first 50 years of my life, it was survive. It was, um, I'm just gonna get through this, and I'm gonna make a living, and I'm gonna at one point climb the corporate ladder, kind of pursue what I thought society considered success. But then at age 50, I hit rock bottom, and it was shortly after the mold and the fire, and my wife and I divorced, and um, I just really hit rock bottom.
Sure.
And the turning point was a reconciliation with God.
Hmm.
Um, as my grandmother was in the hospital, quadriplegic, when this first happened, when they brought her to the University of Michigan Hospital by helicopter, I went up to the chapel while she was in surgery, and her brother came to find me in the chapel. And her brother was a Baptist minister, and he sat down next to me and he put his arm around me. And I said, um, do not talk to me about your effing God, Uncle John.
Hmm.
And that was when I cut things off with God. I had grown up in a Wesleyan Methodist church and went all the time. The church was important to me, but that's when I
Yeah.
said, it's a crapshoot. Life, there is no God. And so that was for many years. So I'd hit rock bottom. I'm 50 years old. I'm lying in bed one night, and I look up, and for whatever reason, I say, why did you abandon me? Talking to
Mm.
God.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I heard this voice, and it wasn't an audible voice. Who knows if it was my subconscious, or, I'm not going to assign anything to
You
that.
heard a
But
voice. Yeah. Well, what
I
did
heard a
it say?
voice. It said, I never abandoned you. You left me, and I'm always here, and I always love you.
Mm. Mm.
And that was the start of the turnaround. And so at that point in time, I was doing some writing, some journaling every morning about magic and its meaning of magic. I started doing magic when I was 7 years old. And I remembered the first lessons of magic from when I was a kid. You learn how to make something appear, how to make something disappear, and how to restore something. And so I was writing about that one morning, and I thought, wait a minute,
Mm.
that's a pretty cool approach to life. And so I started thinking about, well, what do I want to appear in my life? What needs to disappear? And what do I need to restore? And I actually used that as like a
Framework.
framework.
Yeah.
I started writing about what I wanted in my life and what I needed to get rid of and what I needed to heal. And I just pursued that. It became my plan. And
Mm.
my goodness,
Mm.
everything changed. I found peace.
Mm.
Um, I About 6 months after I had heard this voice about 6 months later. Jennifer showed up, who is my wife, and she's the best woman I've ever known in my life. Well, Nin was pretty great too.
They
Jennifer
can be
is
tied.
they're tied.
They can be tied.
I think they'd both be okay with that.
Yeah.
And she's just changed my life. She's incredible. And
Mm.
so and you know, as you mentioned earlier, that this is another thing that at that time when I hit rock bottom, a friend of mine said, you know, our mutual friend is a therapist who actually teaches EMDR, eye movement desensitization
And reprocessing.
and reprocessing,
Yes.
EMDR.
I'm EMDR certified. So, yes.
So I went to someone that our friend recommended and did some EMDR therapy around my grandfather's death and had some breakthroughs that allowed me to kind of get to another level
Hmm.
mentally and emotionally. So therapy, reconnecting with God, the practical aspects of getting clear about what I wanted, what I didn't
I
want,
love
and I
that framework. Yeah. What do I want to make disappear? What do I want to make appear?
yep,
And how do I want to
restore.
restore?
Yep,
Hmm.
which is about healing
Hmm.
things that have been broken or damaged, um, relationships, your integrity with your values, um, your health, all those things that we can restore. And
This is
so
post-traumatic growth. It's post-traumatic growth we're talking about. You have used your trauma and your suffering to not only transform your own life, but I've seen the work you do through the TED Talk you gave and the other things that you've put out into the world have been healing for other people. It's such a gift to have you come on this podcast episode and really share this framework. I think it's extremely practical and it's going to help a lot of people.
thank you, Shauna. That's where I am now in my life is that I feel like, um, you know, as we mentioned, I continue to heal and work on my healing. And I also am at a point where I feel like I both am capable of helping others heal, but I also, that's the main thing I want to do is
Yeah.
help other people heal.
Yep. So to kind of wrap up, although we could probably talk for a few hours here, I'm sure. Um, what is one thing that you think people need to better understand about trauma?
I think it's that realization that you and I came to in our pre um, podcast conversation, and that we've talked a lot about today, which is acknowledging trauma in your life and being okay with it not being the great big trauma.
Mm.
There's so much in our culture and society these days about people being hypersensitive. The whole snowflake thing, like you're just this delicate, fragile being, you can't handle anything. And I think that it's important for people to realize that the less obvious
Yeah,
things that happen to us can be traumatic, and that to
absolutely.
name them as traumatic is maybe the first step at working on something that can really make a big difference in your life and give you more joy, and it will impact the people around you.
Right. Because what you don't know or what you don't acknowledge controls you.
Yes.
So
Yes.
trauma is not just the big things that happen to you, but the things that didn't happen for you that we need belonging, love, acceptance from those primary people in our life. Might not be a biological parent, but in your case, your father's abandonment was, I mean, if I'm hearing you right, was the thing that has impacted you more than some of those other traumas that from the outside we might say, boy, I don't know how you'd survive that. And yet the abandonment is the one that's really shaped your identity and influenced you perhaps more than some of those other traumas.
Yeah, it has. Damn it.
Yeah. but you're in process, and
Yep.
I believe you'll get through to the other side. I really do. And I look forward to, staying in touch on this conversation and seeing how you go. We might have to bring you back if you're open to it, and kind of checking in with you in another few months and seeing where you're at on your recovery journey, because you're really self-reflective and articulate about your own experience. And I really honor the perseverance that I see in you to not stay stuck, but to keep pushing towards healing regardless.
Thank you, Shauna. And I am more than happy to share my experiences. That's what I really want to do in my life, is take the risk to open up because it can help other people. And I'm equally grateful to you for this podcast and for shining a light on trauma in a more robust way. It's going to
Thank
help
you.
a lot of people.
Thank you. I hope so. Thank you, Andrew, for coming on.
My pleasure.
One of the things that stood out from Andrew's story was this: Andrew lost his grandfather and his father, though only one of them died. Andrew's grandfather died by suicide as a result of a mental health struggle. Andrew grieved hard for him and still does today. But the trauma of his father moving less than a mile down the street and starting a new family is what really took up space in Andrew's psyche. Sometimes people can be there but not there, and this can be a greater trauma than a death. Ultimately, despite experiencing multiple sequential traumas, Andrew has become aware of his trauma while at the same time keeping his heart open. He doesn't admit self-pity and describes his life as being full and rewarding. He's connected with a loving partner and is living into a sense of purpose in the work he does. And his TED Talk is full of heart and wisdom. Check it out if you have time. I'm so grateful to have had this important conversation with Andrew Bennett. Post-traumatic stress is not a life sentence. Trauma can be healed with the right insights, the right treatments, and the right support. The story of our trauma is presented by Stella. Visit www.stellacenter.com to learn more about Stella's breakthrough trauma treatments. Please share this episode with people you care about who have been impacted by trauma. And remember to subscribe on Spotify and other streaming platforms.